The Sikh Human Rights Group proudly presents our Corporate Social Responsibility series. Today's topic, how to address Britain's food wastage crisis. Today you'll be listening to Mr Mark Aston. Mark is 26 years old and has been working in the food supply chain sector for over 8 years. 4 years were spent studying a logistics degree at the University of Hull. During his studies, he also spent a semester studying on Hong Kong and a year at Copenhagen Business School. Since graduating, he has taken up multiple jobs across the food industry, for instance helping to run a startup based on temperature-controlled logistics. This involved working with some of the biggest suppliers and customers in the UK. Since then, he has moved on into the retail sector, taking up the position of an area manager for one of the United Kingdom's largest supermarket chains. In addition to this, he also sits on the board of trustees for Compliments of the House, a community-led food redistribution charity working to cut food wastage in Britain. Compliments of the House aims to change the way that we as a society view food wastage in Britain and turn that into helping as many people as possible along the way. Welcome, Mark, and thank you very much for joining us today.
No worries, thank you.
It's a pleasure. Mark, could I please ask you to begin by telling our audience a little bit about what you and your colleagues are currently doing and have done in the past to combat the food wastage crisis in Britain?
100%. Basically, Columnist of the House, as mentioned, we are a community-led food redistribution charity based out in Brixton in London. The main reason and what we do is there is a huge surplus amount of food that is wasted in multiple different sectors in the UK, and what we aim to do is sort that food out and then redistribute it to those that need it. Unlike, say, the likes of like a soup kitchen or even just a general food charity, why we're a bit different is we service the whole of the food supply chain. So it's not just necessarily food that we make into production and then give out at, say, a soup kitchen. What we do is we pick up often any used or made food that is surplus to requirements, collect that, and then redistribute it. We call that, in essence, our circle of efficiency. So what we do is basically we want to make sure we take all of that food and redistribute it to those that need it. At the moment, we're predominantly based out of the South London area, so Brixton, where we collect a lot of food from restaurants and food service providers across that area and redistribute that through our hub. So what we do with our hub is we have a base. Anybody that needs food or requires food, no matter who and where they come from and who they are, we provide that. And what we do is we believe and we know the stigma associated with those that require and use these services. So for us, we have a hub, and those people that use our service are called our guests. And our guests come and collect the food that we provide them at like 5 o'clock on an evening. And the main aim and what we tackle is making sure that these people get the food that they need. During COVID, we also provided an actual food delivery service where we serviced over 200 families a week, providing as many people as possible food when they couldn't actually leave their property because they were self-isolating or they were being told to isolate for a long period of time. So yeah, that's what we do, and really tackling that environmental crisis that we're currently going through.
That's wonderful, Mark. Thank you very much. My first question for you is, in your expert opinion, how serious is the food wastage crisis in Britain, and what factors do you think have contributed to its emergence?
Realistically, the numbers speak for themselves. When you look at it, if 1/3 of all food that is produced across the world is actually wasted, so whether that be what is grown to what is actually made into the meals that we eat, and 1/3 of that is wasted. And then if you take that into just the UK itself, I think the most recent report I read over had 9.5 million tons of food a year in the UK is wasted, which just in those figures alone show really the scale that we're talking about here. And the worst thing about that figure in the UK, when 9.5 million of the tons of food is wasted in the UK, yet I think it's about 8.4 million are actually classed as being in food poverty. So you put those two figures together, they do not match up. And especially now we're in a time in a period where the cost of living is rising more than anyone has ever experienced before. Even the figures that were released today just show that the average high street basket has gone up. I think it was like 200% or something incredible that no one's ever experienced before. And the fact that we are wasting that much food, yet we have so many people that actually can't get provided enough food, it just doesn't balance out. And you throw that into the reasons and the main causes of that, and fundamentally the worst thing is it's not just like one factor. You can't just go, you know what, that's the reason, and single-handedly let's tackle that. We have a huge amounts of, obviously it's great that we live in a society, in a community that gives us so many options. We can go to the supermarket and pick up tomatoes all year round. We can pick up blueberries all year round from every part of the world, and on top of that you can select over 50 bottles of just white wine in some supermarkets alone. There's this, then you take that on top of that, the food service industry. You can walk down the street, especially around where I'm based, around South London. You've got restaurant after each other. And the fact that we have so many options is great as a society, but it's so difficult to match demand. That's fundamentally business's problem, meeting supply with demand. A business would work perfectly if we knew exactly how many were coming in, but especially for restaurants, especially for supermarkets, you don't have that, and we're dealing with perishable foods. So the fact that we have to, in a sense, guess what's coming, more often than not, you want to make sure you have more than enough. You never want to be left with not having enough and wanting more sales. That's business. And then the issue with that is you're always going to have this little number left over. In some cases it's more than a little, but realistically that is what happens. That's, in a sense, there's so many options where food is utilized nowadays, from production, naturally as well. People's education on the food supply chain is so limited, and that's not calling anyone out. Fundamentally, most people don't know where their chicken comes from, where their food is produced. You actually, there is a very monopolistic market in food production. There's only a very number of small amount of companies that produce nearly every chicken you buy in a supermarket. No matter what supermarket you go to, they're all produced by the same person. And fundamentally, the wastage that then goes around people's needs, whether it's only picking the good veg. Yes, we started bringing out features like wonky veg and stuff now, but all around that, it's the possible broad scope that we appeal to. It's great for the consumer. It's consumerization in a sense, but actually it's created a huge problem below that, which is food wastage. You then throw in things such as the legal side with expiry dates and best before dates, which people physically, for example, my grandparents would never have gone into a shop 60 years ago and ever even worried about buying a carton of milk with a date on it. Yet now supermarkets have to throw them away, even if they don't smell, even if there's no, because milk you physically can see, just because of the legal side of it. And of course, the legal side needs to be there. We need to limit the risk. But what it does is it adds more and more tons of food wastage to a pile that is already too high. So realistically, for me, it's three things. We have a huge cause. It started there, but for me, it all comes down to the consumerization, what we have to offer. Below that, then, realistically, the factors that these companies are restricted to, expiry dates, etc. And then on the bottom of that, the overarching aspect is actually the education of those, and what we're actually buying has created a huge problem in terms of food wastage.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was extremely insightful. My next question is, obviously this is a vast problem which is going to have to be tackled from a lot of different angles, but what are supermarkets and other food sellers specifically currently doing, or what should they be doing to combat the food wastage crisis as you've outlined?
I think because it is such a broad issue, there are things that companies are doing throughout, and it's a very interesting way to look at it. There's some great things out there. For example, in food production facilities, for example, if we some production facilities will use eggs, for example, but they'll only to bake eggs. They won't need the certain elements of it. To bake cakes, they'll only need a certain amount of wastage, and there's always wastage come from that. So there's now really cool and exciting things out there where certain food production facilities will buy the wastage of other food production facilities to turn that into food. So for example, if you're cooked, so a lot of like ready meal producers will only use a certain prime bit of meat, or they'll only use a certain aspect of a food service. If, say, for a meat, they have a part of the animal that they won't be using, yet they have a bulk amount of it, they'll be sending that, instead of what they used to do, which was throw that away, they would now be putting that into sending that off for another company to make that into further food. So that's the initial first, like, sort of behind the scenes aspect, which is really interesting. So in terms of like the visible side, which you see all the adverts for, you have companies such as FareShare, which do provide a great service. So for example, supermarkets say they provide, for example, millions of meals equivalent. That is great. FareShare do a great amount of work. There are, I would personally say, from our experience who complements the house, some negative side effects to FareShare. I think the fact that they often, what they do is, even though they are provided a lot of food themselves from big corporates and in bulk, that's what they have. They build facilities to allow them, so say for example a Tesco, to send them pallets and pallets of food they don't want, and FareShare will then actually sell that to a charity. To me, sometimes it seems like whether that is the right thing. They'll sell it to a soup kitchen because they will then make that into productive to produce to give out on the street. But for me, surely it's actually a donation, it should be free. So there's always the ethical side of that, but they need to run, they provide a great service, they have overheads. So I understand the business aspect of that. You have companies like Neighbourly, which basically is a great platform, which allows loads of small charities to basically sign up to their basically umbrella of companies that they work with. So for example, a company such as Aldi, and what they do is basically every night, if a supermarket has wastage, these small charities turn up, collect the food wasted that night, and then go and use that, whether that be just give it straight out, make it into food, whatever they do, that's up to the charity. When they get them, they have to go through rigorous checks before they're allowed onto Neighbourly. But again, it limits what's going to landfill. And then again, you've got even private companies now, such as Food to Go, which especially sort of tailor towards the food service industry. So you may have seen, but you can go on to now, like you can go on to Food to Go, and you can go and get a Greggs bag for £2.50. You can go and get a Costa bag for £3.99 at the end of the day. It limits what's going to landfill. Although again, there is the question and the element of that, which is, even though, yeah, it's great, that facility, so say that Greggs shop down the road, is now giving out that food instead of sending it to landfill. So for that big corporate, it looks great, but as a customer, you buy that bag for £2.99, more often than not, you will only eat 50% of that bag. You physically don't have it all. What it does is it gets that wastage off the book, shall we say, of that corporate. So whether it's really fully tackling the food wastage crisis, probably not. It's helping, don't get me wrong, it's definitely a great way, but really it's probably just lining the pockets a little bit more of a company and making them look a little bit better, rather than actually tackling it. And that's the same for any of these. Fundamentally, we shouldn't have food wastage. Charities should be only there to, if they need to, buy food. The fact that we have so much going to landfill and wastage shows there is still a bigger problem and an issue that, yes, this is a great solution. These charities, etc., provide a great way of stopping more going to landfill. Why is it being produced in the first place?
Thank you very much, Mark. So supermarkets are clearly doing quite a substantial amount to combat the food wastage crisis, but it's not going to be a single-handed solution. Which leads me on to my next question, and that is, what should we all be doing in our capacity as consumers to combat the food wastage crisis?
I think it all the points I was making before, which all comes around sort of consumerization. And don't get me wrong, I'm probably another person. I'll put my hat. I'll be the first to admit I do the same. I love that I can go down to my local supermarket and I can buy strawberries in November, and I can buy blueberries all year round, and I can get lettuce. I can get all my lettuce fresh as soon as it is. But the issue with that is that we naturally don't necessarily shouldn't be having that. And on top of that, the issue that comes with that is, more often than not, it isn't an issue if I went into a supermarket and I had one tomato to buy, and I had one lettuce to buy, and I had one cucumber to buy. But in the world we live in now, you can go to the Asda down the road from me and you can pick 8 or probably even more. I haven't physically counted. I know the Aldi that I shop in, you can pick up to 7 tomato range of tomatoes, which to me is an incredible amount. A supermarket, no matter which supermarket it is, yes, you have 7 and probably in some even more for the varieties. You can get sun dried, you can get plum, you can get salads, you can get all different specially selected, you can get extreme element, extra sun, all of these different ones you can get. But actually, we all just want a tomato. And what this does is it really adds to that sheer amount of wastage, because having so much variety, you forget that they have to be transported, not always going to be sold. If you just had tomato after tomato, yes, that would be wasted, but actually that really limits the food waste because you haven't got so much variety. And that's the same, with the ranges that we now have in supermarkets is phenomenal, and it's great for their bottom line, but realistically it's not great for food wastage. And it's also then comes with the same of like buying local. I know I don't sound like some of the people you hear are like going around with signs on the side of a road at the moment, but actually it does come down to the fundamental side of, actually, if you're buying local, like for example, if you did go to your local farmers market, yes, obviously not everyone can have that access because of the price, but it does limit the environmental impact and the food wastage side of things. You are more savvy. There's a less impact to the environment in general from doing that. But of course, then you do have the argument where we live in a world where our costs of living are rising incredibly. So actually going and spending that more on vital things that we want to eat every day isn't cost effective. But actually it's finding that, like, at what point are the consumer, at the government, are we going to decide and understand that actually the sheer amount of food that we are wasting is just incredible, and we need to, in a sense, work out the whole supply chain. We can sit here and say, yeah, it's great, we love the access it is, but actually, as I'm sure we'll go and touch on a little bit later, but it's not just the sheer food wastage. Like, that is an impact, and of course we want to tackle that, and that's what we're here to do. But on top of that, it's to get those 9 varieties of tomatoes, they have to come in 9 different lorries. They have to come to 8 different supermarkets that we have on the high street. So that's actually, when you start adding this up, every supermarket has roughly probably between 8 to 20 regional distribution centres just in the UK alone. Of course, this isn't just the UK's problem. This is the whole of Europe. This is the whole of the world. When you really start looking at these numbers, it is incredible, not just on food wastage, on the environment, because let's be honest, the environmental impact is the circular supply chain. It's the whole supply chain. It's not just production. It's not just getting it here for you to consume. It's the plastic and cardboard and everything involved in production, and then when you eat it, that goes in the bin. It's then the extra food you don't use, that goes in the bin, that's transported to wastage, that's transported to landfill. If it does get environmentally recycled, great, but it's, before you know it, you're really adding to the carbon footprint just for one tomato. You limit the ranges, you limit what's on the shelf, you can limit how you can travel more in bulk. Economies of scale, you can transport it in larger quantities, which allow you to limit the impact on the environment. And then on top of that, it allows you to procure and plan more accordingly, which means more like you're limiting the wastage. But realistically, it's a whole supply chain problem. It's a consumer buying pattern problem. And like I said before, it really does come back to that overarching education problem. If you're looking at what you're buying, not just I want these, you can limit the impact you're having. And also it's something as silly as planning what you're going to eat. I do it often as well. You're buying products and sometimes you're like, what, I didn't actually need that. Why did I buy that punnet of grapes when I wasn't going to be in for 3 nights? Things like that. It's little decisions like that which really exacerbate the problem we're currently facing with food.
Thank you, Mark. That was truly excellent and very rich. My next question is, we've touched on the regulatory side of things before, but more specifically, what do you think, what do you believe the UK government and or our local councils should be doing or are doing to combat the food wastage crisis in Britain? And if you don't believe they're doing enough, what should they be doing, in your opinion?
It's a tough one because there is only so much, let's say, the government, local councils can actually do. I think what's currently in place, there are elements that are very useful. So, even something as simple as food recycling bins in a lot of places, not across the country, it's not unified. So, that's probably something that should be done. But making sure every household, I know in where I live in a flat, I don't have the option of actually recycling food. Whereas I know my parents who don't live in a flat, live in a house, have the option to recycle actual food in a small food recycling bin. Though small, it doesn't add to what's being wasted. It allows the consumer to at least recycle it in the correct way. We know it's then going to the appropriate means and helps back into the supply chain in the environmental way it should be. But there are, of course, things that can be done. There's regulation, of course, that can be done in terms of possibly, depends how far and how wide you want to take this. But with the crisis and with the element we're currently going through, it's probably not too far away. If we do want to hit carbon neutral, I believe, by 2030 and all of these targets the government want to set, a lot of that comes down to not just limiting, like, say, diesel cars. It also comes down to limiting how much we're actually putting on the roads in terms of like products. And to do that, does it mean that they have to say, we're going to have a cap on, even if it's just a supermarket cap on the amount of items they can sell of certain ranges? It sounds so silly, but that would really help limit the impact on not just the environment, but also food wastage. Again, I know just through compliments of the house, we have a great relationship with the local council. So Lambeth, for the one that we do, there's things that they do that really help us and they provide us great support. But then again, of course, they have a lot of plates that are being juggled. And on top of that, they have a lot of financial restraints that's currently being thrown down, just like most public sector elements. But then because of that, it limits the support they can give. We as a charity, we wish we could support more. We could really help tackle that 8 million people that currently live in the food poverty line. But also by just collecting more food, there is so many restaurants that still throw their food away. And, having that funding for a small charity like ourselves is vital. Like I say, Lambeth have been great, really great support, but they're only restricted by how much they have. Bear in mind, they also have tons of other programs and loads of other things that need financial support just as much as we do. So realistically, I think that actually comes down fundamentally top heavy government strategy, funding plans, what direction they want to take. So for me, I think, yes, there's steps that have been taken. It's interesting in terms of recycling and support charities get from the government. We definitely are lucky with what we can get, but then again, I think there is so much more to do. And I think at the moment, in my opinion, the support isn't fully there for food wastage and actually the impact it has. They look more at how to recycle the food wastage rather than stopping it at source, or actually sending it to, in a sense, like compliments of the house, redistributing it. It's all great sending it to landfill and turning it into fertilized soil for growing more foods, but actually when there's millions and millions of people, especially with a lot of the people that we deal with, families, children, that struggle to even get access to fruit and vegetables every single day, when so much is being thrown in a bin, why can't we actually spend and invest more in which would then be cheaper in the long run, because you need less, you need to send less to landfill, which then you charge less for, it's less recycling, etc., and actually people are getting the support they need. So I believe it kind of, again, it comes at looking at that whole supply chain aspect and going, right, it's not just a easy quick win. Yes, we find a solution to the quick win, so it's not just physical wastage, but actually how do we turn it into a suitable and effective solution in the long term? And not always easy. I know it's one of the hardest things people can do is looking at the long term, not the short term. Everyone's always looking for the quick wins, but with something like this, it is a long term view, but it is a solution that needs to be thought of now in the longer term, rather than let's hope, putting a band-aid on it and hoping that the wound doesn't open anymore.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm sure our audience can't either. My next question for you, Mark, is what do you believe? I mean, we've touched upon this before when we spoke about a lot of our poultry coming from the same farms in Britain. But what are the other common misconceptions surrounding our food supply and distribution systems, and how have these factors contributed to the emergence of our food wastage crisis?
Without harping on the same tune again, one of the biggest problems is just realistically, to be honest, say for example, there is one company out there that produces the majority of our chicken in the UK. They send it to every supermarket. That actually isn't the worst thing in terms of food wastage and / the impact on the environment through the supply chain, is because at least it's coming from one source and then multiple channels outwards, but at least it's going through one source. They can plan and process more effectively, and they're trying to save costs. So if they may deliver to 2 supermarkets at once rather than one supermarket at a time, I think it does show that in terms of the for example, with chicken, the predominantly amount of chicken that we are every supermarket you go into are from the same source, the same company. They own the same poultry farms. So whether you pay £3 or £1.69, it's the same chicken. It's from the same place. So there is a economical factor of that, where that would help in the sense of just generally, cost of living's going up. If people had more visibility to the supply chain and knew about where a lot of our food was coming from, it would allow us to be a little bit more open to what we buy, helping us with the cost of living. But in terms of the actual supply chain and environmental impact, it all comes down to actually knowing where your food comes from. Chicken's actually not too bad because it comes from the UK. But when you look at back, especially with fruit and vegetables, when you look at every ready meal, processed frozen foods, the majority of food we consume in the UK isn't produced in the UK. And that's not saying that we should buy British and stick by that. Of course, again, it comes with prices, it comes with actually being able to be sourced, but then that has a huge environmental impact. I love that I go down the road and get blueberries whenever I want it. What that does mean, though, is you're shipping, because it's not just Tesco, it's Tesco, Asda, Aldi, Lidl, every supermarket has them. They source them from different places around the world. So you might go into Asda and you'll get South American blueberries. You might go into Tesco and get South American blueberries, but from Argentina, not Peru. Like, what this does though is they're on the same ships. They're then being taken off at port. It's going on different lorries. It's going to port. It's going to all these different shops. The physical environmental impact on that one singular punnet of blueberries, though it's great economies of scale, we fill that container up, It's the fact that we need those blueberries in the first place. And that comes down to generally choice. It's great that we can have 50 bottles of wine in the supermarket. And of course, there's great supply chain advancements, such as a lot of wine that we drink in the UK isn't transported bottled. So what they do is they transport it in like an air bed in a container, deliver it to, say, Avonmouth in Bristol, put a massive hose on the end and suck it out and bottle it in the UK. That's great. But that container has travelled all the way from Australia, all the way from New Zealand, when you do have wine in France. You can't even get wine in Kent nowadays. Of course, don't get me wrong, we love that we have this ability now with a supply chain to consume all of these products and at a great price as well. And of course, doing that solution for wine, for example, makes it much cheaper, cost effective. You're not carrying that heavy amount of bottles. It's better it is better for the environment. It's cheaper, etc., etc. But you're still transporting this product all the way from New Zealand. There is an environmental impact on that, whether we like to admit it or not. And then that comes down to things such as salad and tomatoes. It's great that we have all these varieties of tomatoes. It's great that we can get all these cucumbers, but the majority aren't grown in the UK. And if they are, they're grown in greenhouses that take a lot of power and a lot of solutions to make work. The worst of all is often every supermarket in the country will be buying lettuce, tomatoes from Spain. That's the fundamental, one of the biggest providers to the UK market. But the problem is there's probably roughly only around 4 to 5 big groups that own the farms in Murcia, the south of Spain. That's great, but the laws in the UK mean that the supermarkets especially can't really cooperate that well together, just due to the laws that are involved and the trading laws that we are bound by. But what that means is that you are left with, for example, a lorry that's going to Tesco, a lorry that's going to Asda, and a lorry that's going to Aldi will be leaving the adjacent farms next to each other, possibly not even full or full to the brim at times, and they'll be driving together literally in convoy all the way through Spain, all the way through France, over the ferry, in the tunnel, and into the UK. And then they'll be driving the UK, whether that's up to Scotland, whether that's up to Newcastle, if it's going up to Birmingham, or even just down in Kent. They're still coming that way. It's a 3-day trip, and then they have to go back the other way. We as a country do not export that much. So naturally, often these vehicles are running empty before you know it, just because me, Barbara, Dale, whoever they are, want that real fresh product and want it all year round. We have a huge environmental impact on that often people across supply chain just don't see and is not visible to. And yes, it's great, but for example, my grandparents, even my parents, all had they all lived, they all survived, they all without as much of the supply chain accessibility and products that we have to offer today. And I love that we have so much options, but I do believe there is a huge sort of deficiency in, yes, it's great, but do we actually know the impact it's having? It's often covered up because it's great, we pay 20p more, we get a nice tomato or whatnot, but actually, do we see the impact that's having? And that's across the board. It's in food production, it's in the food service industry, it's in absolutely everything that we love and we go around doing, but there is an impact at everything we're doing. And that's not even taken into account then, having all of this. So we've gone through all that process to get that fruit and veg here, and finally, because it's gone another lorry to get to a shop, and we finally got it on the shelf. And we then haven't even thought about the fact that sometimes 8 or 9 units of that in every single supermarket shop across the country is thrown straight in the bin. It's literally come all the way from Spain to be thrown straight in the bin. It's nonsense. It is absolutely nonsense. But the problem is it's not anyone's fault. The visibility just isn't there, and it's not so much that it's hidden. It's not like anyone's trying to like deceive the consumer. It's just more the information just isn't readily shared. It's not necessarily known. I've only been visible to it due to what I've studied and then what I've gone and worked within. Whereas, you know, and it does physically make me think about what I'm buying and what I'm using. But then of course there's always that element of price. You know, often your cheapest food is the one that really doesn't take into account the environmental factor, because it's the one that's got here in the cheapest and most efficient way, rather than the most environmentally friendly way, because often the cheapest is probably the worst for the environment more often than not, other than if you're benefiting from, say, economies of scale. But yeah, realistically, I could go on for hours about the issues, but realistically, it all comes down to the fact that without that information readily shared, we have a huge problem in the supply chain in terms of the environment, and then that all adds up and equals the impact then on the food wastage and the circular supply chain, because that food that's wasted then has to get put back into the supply chain in some way, even if it's incinerated, because a lot of food, meats, etc. have to be incinerated. It can't be reused. There's then the greenhouse effects of incineration. So yes, it creates power, great, but actually there is an impact of that. So fundamentally, the circular supply chain for food is one that should be taught more, should be understood more, but really isn't.
I can agree more. I think there's some huge gaps in our national curriculum that need to be filled. I mean, on what you've just said, and slightly off script maybe, do you believe that it would be beneficial for consumers to have on the packaging the food miles that is taken for, say, the punnet of grapes to arrive at the store? And do you think that supermarkets would be open to that kind of thinking?
Personally, I think it would be a great thing to add on, whether people would fully understand. But, you know, if you put on there this, you know, if you were like, for example, if I was an actually environmentally focused food production company, I would love to put on the bottle of my carton or the side of my punnet saying this has travelled 120 kilometres, the equivalent of, you know, X to Y, as a little advertisement ploy, if every other item also had that on, because it really could then differentiate yourself in the market. But I really don't think the supermarkets would be on board with that. And the reason being is they do kind of hide behind, not directly, they don't on purposely create this image, but let's be honest, we go into the supermarket, we just pick it up, and even though it has the name of the country on it often, you know, you can turn over any processed food and you can see where its production facility is. But let's be honest, who does that? You know, barely anyone ever does that. You know, you're not going to go through every single ready meal and see, right, that was produced in Belgium, that was produced in Holland. Oh, this one was produced in Kent. Let's take that one. You're not going to do that. If it was on the front and it was made accessible, just like, say, we have with the dietary requirements on food now, I think it would be great. It'd be a great asset, and it would really show people, and, you know, again, it had that visibility on what's there. Whether supermarkets, etc., would be on board with that, I don't know.
Yes, I can see that. I think maybe it's more about limiting choice and having two sets of tomatoes rather than the 10 that are readily available at most supermarkets across the UK at the moment. Sorry, Mark, moving on. Do you believe that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a detrimental effect on our consumer habits? Yeah.
I think it's been obviously it's been an unprecedented time that none of us have experienced before. I think you can see it very much now with the restriction in supermarkets from the crisis of not just COVID, but also Brexit on top of this. Not to really diversify, I know we can have hours about these things, but like the COVID created a huge problem with supply, whether that was just actually being produced, whether that was being picked, whether that was being delivered, and the time that it took. So you saw a lot more empty shelves on the supermarket. And I think it may, you know, let's be honest, and I think what it did show you was, in a positive, you go in, oh, I can only get one type of tomato, oh, that'll have to do. But actually, you're still going to eat that tomato and you're still getting the same nutritional element that you wanted and the taste you wanted. Might not have been the one you really wanted to go in and get, but that's because we've been told we can get 8, when actually there was just one, we picked that one. So that was maybe a positive side of it. But I do think, again, COVID has changed the way we do things a little bit more. I think, it's a hard one with, say, food supply, the service industry. That was, again, heavily impacted. With COVID, there was a huge sort of very initial, when all the service industry closed, there was a huge wasted issue because it kind of got backlogged. Suddenly you shut all restaurants and pubs, they stop ordering. They throw everything out that they had. You saw a lot of last minute, come and order this to your home and would give you it cheap because we're going to throw it out. They did it with beer, etc. But then that's what you see as a consumer, but then you don't see behind the scenes where, because of the 4-day lag, if you're Covent Garden Market, one of the biggest wholesalers in the UK, if you're there, you've got, okay, the pubs are closing on Tuesday. On Wednesday, nobody's going to be coming in and buying any more of our produce, but we had to order that from Spain Tuesday the week before when we didn't know it was going to be shutting down, which then means those deliveries are still coming in, and that caused a huge food waste issue for the first initial part of COVID. It was a new issue. At least then they could start tailoring their orders, etc., back onto track. But it was definitely an initial big issue on wastage. In terms of compliments of the house and what it did for us. For us, it allowed us to, or I say allowed us is probably the wrong word, but it meant that we needed to service more people. The fact that people were isolated and stuck at home, they still needed that food. And what it did expose is the lack of support for people in need when they necessarily can't go and bang down the door and get that support. There were so many people, we supported way more people than we had the weeks before COVID, because we had so many people coming to us, and even we had the councils referring people every week to us because they hadn't got the network to support these families and these individuals, and they came to people like us who were able to cope and change our operation. We had a hub. Of course, we couldn't open the hub when we were locked down, but what we did was we utilised a sports centre in Brixton, created that into a mini little production facility where we packed orders for as many people as possible each and every day, put them in vans and sent them, and did home delivery, completely free, of course. But it allowed people that were isolated and trapped in their own homes without any support, the most vulnerable as well, those that physically were not just unable to, but scared to leave the home naturally. They had no support. So being able to provide that for a charity side of things, of course, it gave us a great bit of exposure, and we had to really operate differently. But it limited what we could do with the food service industry in tatters, with nowhere open. That was one of our main sources of food. That was what we do, is we go around loads of restaurants, pick food up and put it in our hub, and people come and get it. Without that, what do we do? So we were blessed enough that our founder created a great plan to go to Lidl in the morning before it opened, built the relationship with them, and went and actually bought food, and that's where we did our packing from. But we were able to be agile like that. But I'm sure there were many other charities, many other companies that couldn't, and those are families that just didn't and received the support because this infrastructure wasn't there. And I think that's what, for me, COVID did, especially for the industry, is provide the exposure, that the support for those who most need it is not as transferable and as visible as it really, really needed to be. In terms of food wastage, I think it was just the same. The food didn't really stop, other than now when we're at the back end, where actually the supply has dried up. But so it's probably lowered the wastage in itself. But other than that, we're still able to buy as much as we want. We still can do all of that. And if anything, we were probably cooking at home more and wasting more because a lot of people were bored. I don't have the figures. I can't say that. I'm more speaking from just the experiences that I saw. But there was definitely it seemed like a want to change the variety. The disposable income went up, because you were spending less out. So probably you were buying more. You weren't buying it on services like going to the cinema or going and playing games or going to the football. You were at home, so you were actually buying more food and utilizing that. So I'm sure there was probably a greater correlation from that, but just from the charity aspect, we definitely saw a complete change through COVID.
Thank you, Mark. That was really excellent. My final question for you is, this is obviously a monumental challenge that lies ahead, and it's going to take us changing our consumer habits, rethinking our legislation and the regulatory provisions behind it all. But if there was one small thing or one message that our audience could take away today or adopt into their daily routines, what advice would you give them, to help combat the food wastage crisis?
Probably the most inevitable answer I'm going to give today. You can probably work it out from everything I've spoken about. But fundamentally, it comes down to actually looking at what we put in the basket, and not just looking at it physically. It's knowing where and what it's coming from, and the impact that it's having. And also with that comes making sure we know why we're putting it in our basket. Are we going to use it? Where it's come from, the impact it will then have later down the line. Are we actually going to use it? Has it got we say it has an expiry date on it, it has a best before date, but are we going to use that in that time if we aren't someone that's comfortable with using it after that time? It all comes down to fundamentally what we are physically buying and having that understanding. If we can create that education, and it does start in the education system early on. It also comes with, like we mentioned before, supermarkets possibly actually educating consumers as they buy, actually making that supply chain more visible. It's not just, it's the thing that happens and when we get food, understanding it more. If we understand what we're actually picking up, putting in our hand and then using, will help us understand our habits, what we do. And if we start changing our habits and what we're buying, naturally the supermarkets will only buy and only sell what we want. If we start demanding and wanting the things that benefit not just us personally, but also everything around us, whether that be the environment, whether that be wastage, we can really impact everything we do. And then icing on the cake, if we then can sort the final, say, the output. So whatever is wasted, there's always going to be wastage. But if we can just turn that wastage, we turn that tons of wastage that we have, turn that into a really positive output, which is actually, this needs to go to the right people. It's not just, okay, there's wastage, let's recycle it, happy days, we're keeping everyone happy. Yes, I love to recycle. Everyone loves to recycle. We know why we do it. But we're recycling for the point of recycling. If we can actually, again, inform, understand that actually, why don't we give? Why don't we utilize what we're having? It also comes down to the fact that if we're buying what we need, we can then possibly supply more at the back end. So yes, okay, we aren't wasting that grapes, but okay, maybe now the supermarket can actually give that grapes straight to the person that needs it, rather than it going in the bin or it going through a charity. Realistically, that's what we need to look at. But to do that, it only comes down to informing, making an informative decision when we put it in our basket, and understanding the impact every single item has.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you so much for taking the time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to be with us today. It's been a pleasure having you on. I just have a few concluding remarks, and that is, this podcast has been brought to you by the Sikh Human Rights Group. For more information about Mr Mark Aston, Compliments of the House, or the Sikh Human Rights Group, please visit our respective websites, the links to which can be found within the description to this video. Or alternatively, please visit Sikh Human Rights Group social media accounts at SHRG_NGO. I've been Carlos Arbuthnot. Thank you very much for listening.